and welcome along. I'm Chris Mann, and as you can see, I'm live from the BBC studios in Cambridge. The subject for the next hour, Before the West, Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. And I can tell you something just to start off with. I've got two great guests, by the way, who are going to be talking with me. Ayse Zarakol, Professor of International Relations at the University of Cambridge, and Hans van der Ven, Professor of Modern Chinese History, as well, as you can see there on the screen now with me. The subject matter for this was selected many months ago. The event was organized and the panel chosen long before the invasion of Ukraine. This discussion was due to take place and being recorded a couple of weeks ago, and then to be played out today as a recording. But we all felt the events in Ukraine are moving so fast that it should be live so we can be up to date and react to what's going on right now. Because although we're talking potentially about things that happened a long time ago, what is happening in front of us all right now is just as important and very relevant. So we're going to talk about Before the West, Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, based on this book by one of our guests. There we are. You see it quite prominently there. So we'll talk about that. I also want to just tell you that, and there's no expense spared with this, you can take part and give us your question, your points of view, interaction with us. Slido.com 883-881 is the number. Slido.com 883-881. I did that at the start. It's very good, isn't it? Very blue, Peter. Right, let's meet our two special guests. First of all, Ayse Zarakol is Professor of International Relations at the University of Cambridge, a fellow at Emmanuel College. She's the author of After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West, and the editor of the prize-winning Hierarchies in World Politics. And as you see there, she's nicely publicizing the new book. Tell us a bit about that, Ayse.
Yes, thank you. This is a book about in the international relations of Asia, essentially, Asia or Eurasia. There was no such book that provided a grand account of how the different parts of the continent were connected to each other. So that's what I wanted to do, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it in the coming hour.
Hans van der Ven is also with us, Professor of Modern Chinese History, a Director in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at St. Catherine's College, previously served as Chair of the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He's also Guest Professor at the Department of History of Nanjing University. I should say that Ayse is in Cambridge, as am I, at the business park on the BBC studios. But Hans is joining us live from New Delhi, aren't you, Hans?
I am in New Delhi. It's a very different world. It's my first time in India. Been a lot to China, of course, but I'm learning to see China from the bottom up, from an Indian perspective, and that's been very interesting. Much to learn still.
We'd love to hear just what is the Indian perspective on what's going on right now in Europe, in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, well, Modi is maintaining his relationship with Putin, so he is using sort of the non-aligned movement, that kind of history, to assert a degree of neutrality. So staying out of Western alliances and staying with Putin. I think the real reason for that is that India remains very dependent on Russia for arms supplies. And of course, India has a lot of internal problems. There's trouble in Kashmir, the Naxalite problems in the center of India. So the military situation remains difficult. I was quite stunned, actually, walking around India, around the archive. There are a lot of soldiers on the street, and there's a defense area. And that clearly, I was used to that in China, but gone away, and I'm sort of being confronted with it again. So the demilitarization of that area has not happened yet.
So there we are. That's our two guests, experts in their fields, with us until 2 o'clock. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. Here's the number, slido.com, 883-881 telephone number. That's how you can put your question, your point of view to us, 883-881. Just go on slido.com. Okay, do it now, and then we can get to your questions, which I hope to do around about 1:30 the hour. Okay, let me just tell you a little bit about me. I'm a BBC journalist and presenter. I'm based here at BBC Radio Cambridgeshire. I'm a former ITV correspondent in Moscow during the Cold War, during the 80s. I covered the conflict in Afghanistan for CNN when the Russians were fighting there. And I was an anchor on Sky News during the first Gulf War. I was later editor of ITN's news radio station for London. Right, let's start off talking about this book, Ayse's book, a brand new book. Absolutely fascinating subject, and of course, all the more relevant. Isn't it amazing how history pops up to teach us lessons right now? Ayse, just tell us, first of all, what is East and what is West? Where's the dividing line?
Thank you. I mean, that sounds like a simple question, but actually it's a very complicated one. I mean, even defining the West, who's in the West? Is Japan in the West, or is, Australia? I mean, right, we could even debate the West, which is a more settled category because we talk about Western history, Western civilization, etc. But when it comes to the East, our imagination of what the East is usually very fragmented. We may think of East Asia or subcontinent, Middle East, or North Asia. We don't even call that North Asia. We call Eurasia, or Russia, essentially. So as I said, what I was trying to do in the book is to kind of connect these disparate parts of the East in one narrative, because they have been connected. Historically, they are actually very connected, going back centuries. I mean, my book starts with the Mongol Empire of the 13th century, which I argue played a similar role as the Roman Empire to Europe, essentially unifying the space under the same sovereign, the same ruler. And then that had, all sorts of legacy effects for centuries to come, shared practices, shared institutions, all across the continent. So that's essentially what the book is about, and drawing lessons from that shared history for our thinking about international relations today.
Hans, what do you make of this, the subject matter? Tell us your view, where you came the book from.
I have a lot of questions, and I think the book is absolutely fantastic. It's a new way of rethinking the role of Asia in world history. Very well informed, very wide range. So I was very excited about it. I like the Chinese parts that you talked about, and maybe that's sort of one issue I wanted to pick up. That struck me as explaining something that I'd always been concerned about and never quite understood. That is the collapse of confidence in Asian elites as they were confronted with the rise of the West in sort of the 18th, 19th centuries. And you relate that to declinist histories. But you're right, of course, that the collapse of confidence amongst the highly civilized, highly educated elites of China, India, Middle East, is something that needs explanation. So could you say a bit more about that? Because that's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Hans. I mean, this is a question that's really concerned me since the very beginning of my career, because I'm originally from Turkey, and of course, Turkey has the same story of, the Ottoman Empire, again, collapse of confidence in the 19th century. So part of what brought me to this book, I mean, my first book is called, as Chris said, After Defeat. But I was interested in why all the elites across Asia in the 19th century, why are they reacting in the same way to European encroachment, the advances of European powers. So I wanted to kind of do a prequel, like what was happening before that, and then I discovered that there are all these shared experiences, and in fact, shared world orders that fragment increasingly from 17th century onwards. And then, in the 19th century, Asian countries, they're not as connected as with each other. And they are all facing, Europe alone, but at the same time, they have similar institutions, similar histories. So they are kind of getting tainted by association with each other. If one of them is defeated or bested by Europe, the others are also getting, associated with that defeat. So that's one of the things I grapple in the conclusion to this book, this shared experience of defeat. Yeah.
I mean, you're quite right, of course. I mean, in the Qing dynasty, and even in early Republican period China, the talk was always about, we don't want to be like the Ottomans. I mean, that would be horrible. That's the nightmare scenario. So they are looking at each other. Maybe switching a bit more to sort of issues we're confronting today. I mean, I think you make a real challenge to the way we talk about international relations. And you say that we should teach ourselves no longer to use words such as great power, international order. Can you tell us why that is so important to you?
Thank you. I mean, it's not that we should never say great power or international order, but I was trying to think beyond the 20th century to certain patterns that have always or generally held true, right, across different time periods. So maybe world order instead of international order, because we take nation states for granted, but they were not around before really 19th century, at least in a global sense. And great powers, again, that's something that we associate with a particular type of state. Before that, you had great houses, great aristocratic houses competing with each other on the world stage. So if we want to imagine, how world politics may change going forward in the 21st century, maybe we need more generalizable terms that are not so steeped in 20th century politics. But of course, the recent events may suggest that we are not quite out of 20th century dynamics. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as well.
Well, you want to say something more about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Chris already mentioned what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and I mean Russia's war on Ukraine. I mean, one way to read that is it's kind of a throwback to great power, or at least Russia's inability to get away from a certain kind of great power thinking. Yeah, and of course others say it's back to empires and so on. So I mean, there are different ways to read what's happening.
Yeah.
I just remind people that is the Slido number. To go on slido.com if you'd like to ask a question, a point of view to the panel. There's the number there, 883-881, slido.com. Go on, ask us a question, point of view. Love to hear from you. I'd like to ask both of you, this, as you call it, Russian war on Ukraine, this invasion, is it a sign of strength or weakness, what's Russia doing right now? Because as you know, very often empires have had a sort of last blast, haven't they? They've got it very wrong. Perhaps the Ottoman Empire is an example of that, and it's crumbled soon afterwards. Are we seeing Putin acting from strength or weakness in your view? Ayse first, please.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, actually, I have two answers to that question. One about Russia specifically, but one more general answer. I mean, I do think Russia is acting from a position of weakness, and in fact, I mean, Putin is, and I think it's events haven't turned out as Putin imagined. It's not the best case scenario. It's pretty much close to their worst case scenario as well. So that would be my take on specifically what's happening now. But I think given what's happening, in Hungary, elsewhere, I don't think, and also the general degree of non-reaction in parts of the world to what Russia is doing, I don't think we can completely say, this is going to end in a victory for like the liberal international order. So I think those early, celebrations are also a bit premature. I think even if Putin is defeated, what he represents or the kind of politics he represents may go on to live on, I think, unfortunately. Yeah.
Hans?
No, I agree with that. And I think, Chris, you're absolutely right. It's sort of the decline of an empire just leads to these blowbacks that keep happening. And most empires have done that. The UK did it, my own country, Holland did it, happened to happen as well. And I think, as Ayse says, it's far too early to tell whether this is, the West has rediscovered its might and will continue to run the world, or, our attention spans tend to be too short for that. I guess one point to make in the context of the rise of China or not is that people were talking a lot about, Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping, getting ready to now take back Taiwan, which is in some ways a similar thing. Taiwan, he claims, used to be part of China. It's historically debatable, really. And I guess, the ways that things have unfolded in Ukraine is a very big warning to him. That militarily, that is simply not going to be very easy. And, at least the Russian army could drive into Ukraine. But for any Chinese army to sail over the Taiwan Straits and deal with a population that is absolutely hostile to the Chinese Communist Party is going to be a very different thing. So if that leads to, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was going to say, so has this put a marker down, what the Russians have tried to do and clearly failed to do in Ukraine, hearts and minds, isn't going to happen, is it ever?
No.
Will that actually be a huge lesson to countries like China? Don't do this?
I hope that lesson must be absorbed. They're not stupid. And I think that, I've done a bit of military history. And if Xi Jinping and Putin really were in all this together, then militarily it would have made sense for them to take Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time. That would be a far more difficult challenge for the West than what they're confronting now. So I think that says also something about that relationship.
There's been quite a few essays written recently about, is 2022 going to go down as one of those years? The 476, the fall of Rome, Norman conquest, 1066, Napoleonic Wars, 1815, Year of Revolutions, 1848, Nazi defeat, 1945. You'd say this fall of the Soviet Union, 1991. Is this year a seismic moment in the shift of power in the world order?
Should I take the question?
Yeah.
Well, we have these benchmark dates, but usually they are a culmination of, larger trends. And in fact, you could say we've had one of those years, many of those years in a succession. And I think that does suggest, if not this year, I think we are in this moment of transition into what? It's not very clear, which is one of the reasons why I want to think big historically with this book, because there's so much uncertainty. And yeah, it may be, all the benchmarks dates you mentioned are actually from a particularly European timeline. So it may be that we're even in such a bigger shift that, we're going to, a greater power shift globally that, we will need different types of benchmarks, different cultural benchmarks to make sense of what's happening, maybe.
So has East, in your view, has East always developed separately from West?
Well, I'm not arguing that they're actually separate. They are very connected. It's just, from at least the 13th to 7th century, although you could take it further back, the real, center of gravity globally, economically, etc., is in Asia. And then what happens is that shifts to Europe, to the West. So it's not that they are disconnected. They are very connected. It's just where the center of gravity is, I think. That's what concerns me.
And Hans, yeah. I'd like to get your evaluation. Sometimes, watching powers think, right, this is our moment because the others are preoccupied. We should do something now. Is that being thought at all in the East at the moment, do you think?
I'm sure that people are always considering their opportunities, the alternatives that might be possible. I want to sort of respond to your question of, is this a year of great change? And I'm going to go out on a limb and say no. And this is also a challenge to Ayse, who sort of ends her book, I think, in a very lovely way with this contemplation about whether China is the rising power, the new great state. And she says, well, that will only be true once China stops listening to Europe, to the West, and that's just not happening. We know far less about China than China knows about us. They're deeply concerned about what we do and think and play. But my question to Ayse would be, I think the years of change have happened. And it is the Second World War in Asia, which was combined with the collapse of all these empires, new states emerging, new states that were thinking in new ways about what a state was, how it should be organized, and what the international order should be like. So when we look back at this 100 years from now, I suspect that we will see all these things that were happening in this very volatile period in Asia, which we have kind of ignored in talking about the Second World War, actually beginning a whole series of changes that now has led to the re-rise of Asia. So I'm promoting my own future work. I hope you forgive me for
yes.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I look forward to reading your book, Hans, on that. And I mean, I'm open to be persuaded, that actually all of 20th century is like, a period of transition. Hobsbawm's short 20th century. Because there is, in my book, I talk about the 17th century as a essentially a period of general crisis and transition, and that lasted not quite a century, but maybe 70, 80 years of fragmentation and new ways of, and from that fragmentation and chaos, both in Europe, wars, rebellions, and also in Asia, came maybe new ways of doing things. And that fragmentation allowed new actors, in this case Europeans, to take over existing frameworks in Asia. So maybe the equivalent, I mean, my thinking is that the 21st century is like the 17th century, but maybe it's the 20th century that is like the 17th century. So I'm open to be persuaded by your arguments.
Can I ask you both about the D word? That's it's a Western idea, isn't it? Democracy. We hold it dear apparently here. It's not thrived quite so much in other parts of the world. You could argue the East being one of those. Do you think democracy in the East will flourish or not? And does it matter?
Shall I go first? Give you a break, Ayse. So Taiwan is, of course, the great counterexample here. And Taiwan has become, it's a big country, really. It's 25, 30 million people. It's a really great democracy, and it is, it's emerged out of martial law in an absolutely fantastic way. So it's such an example. You can also point to Korea, South Korea, not the North, of course. But I think in general, you're right, that democracy hasn't fared so well across most of Asia. My own, I guess my comment would be that change in China is, we can do a lot to help bring that about and to create a better political system. But ultimately, it will have to come from the inside. And it is very important for us, therefore, to know more about what is happening in China, the kind of voices that are there. They're very interesting voices talking about interesting ways about the pros and cons of democracy, about how we might constitute a new kind of political system. And I think that is also, I think the realization in China, the arguments in China now is that, yes, the West has done, the last 2 centuries has enormous achievements. We have a lot to learn, but we also have our own traditions to look at, and we need to draw new ideas from that. So I think that too is something of a turning point that begins to answer Ayse's question. They are still mostly listening to Europe and the United States, but they're also finding new inspiration in their own philosophy, their own heritage, their own traditions, their own religions. And so how that is going to change, what that might look like, whether we'll give the word democracy, I don't know. But these are, I think, are very interesting things that are taking place now.
Can I also jump in there, Chris, before you go on?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think democracy or pluralism are necessarily owned by, any culture. In fact, I mean, in the historical period that I'm discussing, from 13th to 17th century, Asian societies tend to be more pluralist when it comes to practices of, different religions and cultures, etc. It's Europe that's very severely policing, this is the right way to be a Christian, the Inquisition or witch trials, etc. And perhaps because it's so oppressive in Europe, then there is a kind of rebellion against that, which, introduces mechanisms of, checking that type of power. And maybe because Asia is more nonchalant, it doesn't quite develop those mechanisms. I don't know. We can speculate about that. So these types of, I mean, in the long durée, it's not clear who's going to end up with which type of values. And as Hans said, there are examples of democracy in Asia, and we shouldn't necessarily, take democracy in the West for granted. I mean, there are a lot of threats undermining democracy here as well. Everywhere it has to be fought for.
Yeah.
Did you mean Donald Trump?
Yes.
Listen, there's the number. Slido.com 883-881 is the number. No expense spared with this. Please get in touch. I've got loads of questions. I think we should move on to that. Now, I'm just going to mention a couple of dates. Personally, I saw Reagan and Gorbachev walk through Red Square. I was there in 1988, May 1988. The Cold War was over, they said. I was there June of 89. He went to Bonn. Gorbachev met Chancellor Kohl, and he was asked about the Berlin Wall, and he said, anything's possible. And by the end of the year, it was. It had gone. Yeah, amazing, just amazing. And yet we are where we are right now, with it looks like another Cold War. Can I ask you just, first of all, where do you think it's gone wrong? What's happened? Why hasn't it continued on that path to what appeared to be this unity between that part of the East and our West? Ayse or Hans, I'm happy whoever would like to go first on this one. Ayse?
Yeah. Actually, I've written about this with a co-author, Rebecca Adler-Nielsen from University of Copenhagen. We have written on the crisis of the liberal international order, and I mean, it's almost overdetermined why the liberal international order ran into trouble. So there are economic explanations, but what we emphasize is actually there are a number of countries that are kind of in, like Eastern Europe, but they're not fully in, and they feel that they're being treated as second-class citizens, and that creates resentments. And these populist politicians use that type of resentment to whip up, anger at the liberal elites. I mean, there's a version of that, of course, in the West as well. But the arguments are especially popular. I mean, you see in Hungary is a good example. And then these governments undermine the order from within. I mean, this is one of the things that we draw attention to. But I'm sure Hans has his take on it as well, and how it looks from from China and India.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a challenge, but I think you've given a comprehensive answer. I would stress the economic impact. I mean, if people's lives don't get better for so many decades, then that's going to have an effect. I guess in China, they were, the reform was opening up and people felt free and did a lot of stuff, and the press was much freer and so on. And I think there the problem is partly it's gone wrong because the political system remains one which finds it difficult to function in peacetime, so to speak. The Chinese Communist Party is an instrument created for revolution, not for stable rule. And then Deng Xiaoping tried to have collective leadership, but that led to enormous amounts of really, really horrible corruption. And so then they switched back to a much more centralized system in which it was corruption that needed to be attacked, has been attacked, not without, of course, factional rivalries. And it's, the elites were seen to be punished. I mean, when we went to nice banquet dinners, in the early years of the reform, there was enormous amounts of good food and enormous amounts of wine and booze, and at least the booze has gone and the number of dishes is much smaller. So to be seen to be acting against liberal elites plays well politically, but no doubt that's true.
Yeah, I feel it was all a bit of an illusion. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Nothing really changed at the heart of things. The same people were still running it. Right, let's go to a question. A reminder there, Slido 883-881. And somebody asking, because the title of the book is Before the West, and somebody asking, should we be talking about after the West? And what will that look like?
Thank you. Great question. And actually, in the conclusion, I do entertain this question. What will after the West look like? And Hans already alluded to it. I mean, in my discipline, in international relations, sometimes it's assumed once China becomes, the dominant power, it will be after the West. And I'm arguing in the book based on, the history I discuss, that it's not so simple. It's not enough for one country, one Asian country, one Eastern country to attain, superpower status to really change the international order, because, it, we didn't have, equal gender relations the moment Margaret Thatcher was, elected prime, or racial relations when Barack Obama became the U.S. president. So a lot of things could remain the same even if China becomes dominant. So what's really after the West means for me is something like what happened to the East. I mean, the East really was central to global order, and the global order was much more connected than we imagined before modernity. I mean, there was a lot of trade, there was a lot of exchange, and the East, and especially China, but all of the East was much more dominant, culturally, socially, in every way. And then we kind of forgot about that. I mean, we kind of forgot that there was even Asian history, right? That this place was connected. We made up, new histories. So if something like that happened, that would be truly after the West. If the center of gravity, as I've been saying, not just economic, but cultural, political center of gravity really shifted from the West, that's what after the West would look like. And I don't think we're there anywhere near there yet. I guess that's good news for some and bad news for others.
No, I agree with that. I think one of the points that Ayse makes in the book is absolutely right, is that for all the decline, to talk about the decline of the United States, it remains a hugely powerful country. It has something like 350 bases around the world. And that's, I think China has maybe half, Djibouti. So it's not even close to, so don't underestimate, this is not going to happen that quickly. But I think after the West, we can see little pointers of what it might look like, certainly in the case of China. And one of the most phenomenal things that China has done in the last 3 decades is to build up a tertiary university sector and a research sector that is absolutely phenomenal, and in which all kinds of things are happening. Enormous investment, of course, in tech, but also in other areas. I was giving a seminar at Peking University, virtually, of course, and there were some people from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia there, and I ended up talking in Dutch with them, my native language, and they had studied the language because they needed to learn Indonesian history. So that kind of build-up of intellectual knowledge potential is just phenomenal. And it's not just in universities. You can see the liveliness in art. We all know about Ai Weiwei, but there are many other very good ones like Xu Ping. So, I think that kind of thing is beginning to emerge. At a more popular level, you have K-pop, anime. Our children are all full of anime and so on. So I think that kind of rebalancing is beginning to happen. Whether that really means it's the end of the United States, I doubt it, not anytime soon.
Thank you both. You mentioned Ai Weiwei, and of course, I should recommend to everybody to go to Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, where his current exhibition, his show is on. It's absolutely
yeah, it is good.
Brilliant, as always. Another question on Slido. Here's the number, don't forget. There's the number, 883-881. Do send us a question. Here's one. Both Russia and China created empires over centuries by continental expansion. Unlike the Western European empires, these have never been challenged. Hans, would you like to take that one first, that statement? Would you agree with it?
Yeah, one point that is hinted at there, which I think is very important. There's this idea that China is a peaceful country, that it never expands. That's absolute nonsense. That's expanded all the time. It has clearly been challenged by a number of countries. First of all, of course, the UK, which waged 2 opium wars in order to be able to sell opium from India to China. Otherwise, the British Empire would have collapsed. And then it was challenged by Japan in the Second World War, which could easily have ended up with the Japanese occupation of China. So the demise of China, the disintegration of China has been talked, was certainly possible at that time, and we would have a very different world. So, and the China that emerged after the Second World War claimed very aggressively, claimed these areas such as Tibet and Xinjiang, and of course Taiwan. And that is creating problems for it. It is kind of a, the kind of Putin thinking about Ukraine is the Xi Jinping thinking about Tibet and Xinjiang and Taiwan. And that will create problems for a very long time to come. But so yes, China has been perfectly capable of being aggressive. It's not going to stop, I'm sure. It's spreading its influence in Burma, for instance. But it has been challenged quite fundamentally. And I think the strength of Chinese nationalism, the feelings about that, need to be understood from the challenges China faced over the last 2 centuries.
Can I jump in also, Chris?
Of course.
Yeah. So one of the points in my book is that Asians were empire builders too, and if you think that's a good thing, they were doing it. I mean, building empires and world orders. If you think that's a bad thing, you have to acknowledge that Asians were doing the same bad things as Europeans. So again, like democracy, like it's not a value that anybody really owns, and empire building, everybody everywhere in the world has engaged in it. So if we have problems, it's not it's not one. We cannot lay it at one culture's feet. Everybody has done it. And I think it's important to realize that.
Slido.com is the way to ask a question. 883-881 is the number. 883-881, slido.com. Is our Western idea of the East fixed? Has it changed over time? In the US, we look both ways. So a correspondent across the pond there. Is our Western idea of the East fixed? Has it changed over time? In the US, we look both ways. It's funny because I always thought the Americans mostly navel gazed. But anyway, what do our experts think on that, Ayse?
Well, I don't think it's a fixed idea. In fact, I'm sure there are historians who study this, how it's changed. Also, it's not the same exactly in the UK and in the US. Different countries have different ideas. I'm in the book. In the epilogue, I talk about Toynbee, and he talked about the Near East, Greece, Russia, Turkey as being the Near East. So these labels are not settled, which is one of the reasons why again in the book I'm trying to unsettle it again. I'm saying East or Asia, like it includes everything from West Asia to East Asia to from North Asia to South Asia, even though we have different labels for these regions. Yeah, so it's not fixed. It's evolving, and the concept of
I think
West is also the same. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
In the case of China, and Americans think a lot about China in the same way that British people think a lot about India rather than China. In the case of China, I think the Americans have sort of projected both their great aspirations on China and projected their greatest fears of China. So it's gone from the Yellow Peril to the great promise of revolution, to the disasters of the Great Leap, to the great hopes of integration of this wonderful country in the world economy, to now being enemy number one. And this kind of jumping back and forth with extreme ideas, of course, simply derives from the fact that actually we can project something on a country because we know so little about it. And it is one of the problems we need to challenge. And I'm just glad to see there's now a UK report, a Higher Education Policy Institute report that calls for that. And I think there's some hope that will be implemented. My own suggestion would be, I mean, East-West is sort of, yeah, that's I understand Ayse's title completely. But I think even such terms as East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Northeast Asia, which are all common, and we have departments named after them. I think it's time to let them go. These are Cold War terminologies, and they keep apart people who have many, many connections. And it's not just people, it's scholars who, Middle Eastern scholars don't know anything about India or China and vice versa. And that's not healthy. We're forgetting all the connections between all these, and which Ayse has brought out in the book. So I think that's, in that sense, it's a real breakthrough. These sort of Cold War terminologies are not helping us think about the world in the right way today.
I'd like to ask you both what we can learn from what happened in Hong Kong, this extraordinary, almost Western outpost, although clearly it's still very, very Oriental, which has now, 20 years on, changed fundamentally. What does that tell us about the future, if anything?
I'm sure what Hans has a lot to say about this, but I'll just quickly say, I mean, what's remarkable is the resilience and the resistance I think Hong Kongers displayed in the face of like terrible odds. I mean, we were talking about democracy in Asia. In some ways, I mean, it's depressing, but it should give everybody hope. I mean, there are people everywhere in the world who fight for their rights, even when they know they're going to lose, right? So that shows there's something there in the spirit which will like live on. But anyway, I'll let Hans answer since this is closer to his expertise.
Yeah, no, I have been traveling to Hong Kong for three times a year for the last couple of years. I've been, my own students are teaching there. Some of my friends are in jail as a result of this, so it's a terribly depressing story. What we can learn from this is that Beijing is really adamant about keeping control over this piece. They're not going to let it go away. They never would. They meant it. They cracked down very hard. Well, I guess 2 points. One is that as horrible, I mean, there were a lot of social problems in Hong Kong which actually need to be taken account of. One was that the government was sort of run on the basis of housing development schemes where, you know, very low income tax, great disparity between rich and poor, great disparity in generational wealth. And clearly that fed into these protests as well. You know, you can't get an apartment in Hong Kong for less than $1 million. Many apartments are small in any case and then divided up. So it's that kind of generational dystopia, of the dystopia of younger generations is very strong. There's nothing's going to be better. So a lack of hope, which was horrible to see, certainly amongst my students. I think the other thing that I did take away from it too is that, you know, we talk about Xi Jinping and he is asserting Chinese control over these peripheral areas, these border areas. I think Deng Xiaoping would have sent in the army. And there's clearly, there was a real attempt to avoid a 1989 massacre, which could have happened as well. Now, whether that's, you know, that is a slight positive in an otherwise desperate situation. I understand what Ayse says about people going to sacrifice themselves. But I've also been talking with Hong Kong students and says, look, things, you know, have a bit of, don't be quite so dystopian about the future. Have some hope for the future. And if you die, your parents will be in awful pain for a very, very long time. Or, you know, if you have children, they will be deeply affected. So there is a long game to play as well. And, you know, so we've had that kind of conversation as well. Difficult, and it's, you know, yes, respect for people who are willing to put their lives on the line, but that also creates pain that is going to last for a very long time.
Slido.com, 883-881 is the telephone number, 883-881. I should say there are a lot of people have come from Hong Kong. You'll know this, Hans, just in the last year or two to live in Cambridge. A lot of people, refugees. 883-881 is Slido.com is the telephone number. Another questioner asking about the rise of communism in the 20th century and how the older Eastern orders developed into communism. So how did that happen and will it last, Ayse?
Well, I think that's a question for Hans. He's the 20th century historian, so I'm going to pass that to him.
I'm just going to plug my own book. I just published a book with Cambridge University Press what was it called? Chinese Communist Party, A Century in 10 Lives. And this it's sold pretty well. And it was actually very nice that it was 10 contributions by 10 people, including two or three from China, major public intellectuals in China, with each writing a story about a person in a particular decade of the Chinese Communist Party's existence. Will communism last? So we have just had 100.
It's lagged down. Come on. Get back to us.
I think we just lost Hans. We'll try and get that back in a moment or two.
You're getting back.
If you didn't realize, he's actually in New Delhi, although he's a professor at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge, but he's in New Delhi for us today. We've got a busy panel. I say that question over communism, obviously, it's a recentish development. Have there been phenomena like that in history that you've studied, that you've seen, that have spread right across the world? I suppose totalitarianism would be a phenomenon, would it? Or?
I mean, communism is a modernist ideology, like the others that we have. So it's in some ways a way of coping across Asia to this problem of, I mean, in the book I talk about the incorporation of Asian states in 19th century to the international order and the various problems this posed, the problem of, catching up or competing with the West. And I suppose I would say it's one way. I mean, the reason why it spread is it's one way of dealing with these problems, one way of solving problems of modern statehood that seemed to be attractive at the time. So I guess the question asked, can you imagine this happening again? Yes. I mean, as long as these problems remain unsolved, we have the individualist answers, or answers that emphasize, the individual, and then we have, more collectivist solutions. And neither ever go out of fashion completely because, there are reasons to find it either compelling. So it's more like, I would say, like a pendulum. Yeah.
Tell me, we never like to, we're sometimes uncomfortable with what our neighbors or even our family think of us. So what does the East think of the West? The man in the street, the elite. I mean, do they think we are something to emulate? Do they think we are weak, strong, powerful? What is the Eastern view of the West?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. As I said, I grew up in in Turkey, in Istanbul, and much of modern Turkish history from 19th century onwards has been about, almost like an obsession with with the West. And I think this is true across Asia. I mean, we talked about this with Asia, with Hans before. And that doesn't mean necessarily like a positive one. In some places, it will be like a very negative reaction, but still the West is the reference. Like, right, in Iran, the West is the referent. In Russia, the West is still the referent. In some places, it's like positive. We want to emulate the West. In other places, it's, we reject the West. But still, you're putting the West in the center of the conversation, or imagining, as I say in my previous book, there's this imaginary Western gaze everybody is kind of feeling in their backs. So I think that's been kind of the pattern in 20th century. Lately, I think there's been a growing sense that the West is getting weaker, or generally is mismanaged, or maybe not so different from the rest of the world, not so special or unique. I mean, there have been a number of crises, one after another, as we've discussed before, that kind of created that impression. Going back to what we were discussing about Putin and Russia, I mean, one could say, some argue that, Putin was bothered by Western encroachment. But I think the opposite is true. He thought the West was at a particularly weak moment and was not going to react at all. So there is this, growing sense among, strong men that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. And the question is that impression going to settle? Are they going to get away with stuff or not? Yeah.
Yeah, when I lived in Russia, I was always struck that people would trot out that excuse, as you say, that for centuries it had been oppressed and invaded by other people, so they were always very wary, particularly militarily. Napoleon and before, that the people were going to come looking for them and invade their country. But now it seems to have been trotted out more as an excuse. Or do they see it very differently from us is the question. Are they are we misinterpreting what they're doing and vice versa?
I mean, I think Westerners don't quite understand how formative these historical experiences have been for the East. I mean, it is true that, also like the national historiography, like the way history is taught in schools, constantly reproduces like past traumas.
I know that because I'm Scottish, so. Oh, have you got hands back? I hear hands.
I'm back. Yes.
Yeah.
Can't see you. Oh, there you are. You're back. Okay. Well, welcome. We got the link back. Excellent. Here's a question. To understand Russia, is it more useful to consider Russia as West Asian rather than East European? A controversial view there. Since we've got you back, Hans, what was your thoughts on that?
Oh, God. Well, I would be really talking on the basis of no knowledge, whatever. I suspect, if this were China, I would answer, well, China is a huge, big country with all kinds of differences within it. And even a split down the middle between East and West probably is not going to deal with the complexity of Russia. But I think, Chris, this really is a question for you.
Go on.
No, no. I thought the question that was just asked about whether
West rather than Eastern European. I think most people in Moscow and West from there think of themselves as European. Of course they do. But if you go down to other parts further east, they very much think of themselves as from a different part of the world. But Muscovites are Europeans. Well, that's what they aspire to be. Absolutely.
But I mean, in terms of historical influences, it's both. There you can see influences of both Asia and Europe on Russia. I mean, it's definitely both. I mean, of course, how people consider themselves is a different matter, but I mean, it's very similar to Turkey in that way. It's a soup of different things, and that's why it's not clear. I mean, when I was growing up, like if I try to say like I'm European, Europeans would say, no, you're not European. But if I say I'm Asian, like that doesn't work either, right? So like, what are we? We are a combination, and I think that's the best answer to that question.
Okay, as we get to the last few minutes of the conversation, I wondered if we could go back and sort of drill down into the Ukraine situation. Hans, I know China hasn't given very much away, but what do you read into what they've done or not done over the first month of this war, when clearly they have been asked to supply things to the Russians but don't appear to have, but they haven't said otherwise?
Yes. I think they say they're trying to stay neutral, not sort of support the West either, but also not support Putin. I think one of the idea that Putin and Xi Jinping, not Russia and China, but Xi Jinping and Putin are sort of hand in glove, that forgets that China and Russia share a very long border, and that lots of Russians in Siberia, for instance, are deeply worried, frustrated, angered by the influx of Chinese immigrants who are, of course, financially taking over, who are marrying lots of Russian women. So the causes for trouble between China and Russia, well, they've been long-standing in any case, but they are still there. This is not a very easy border. I think that is something that Xi Jinping has to take account of. There are geopolitical questions. It was very interesting, actually, that the Chinese foreign minister came to New Delhi, and was it last week, which is quite surprising, really, because they both have to deal with Russia, and is China trying to sort of use this opportunity to rebuild relations with India? They have rebuilt things in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, so they're exploiting that opportunity. I think they're much more oriented towards that than to Europe, and they just want to stay out. China's no role there. And China, of course, has also done a lot in building up support for East European countries, sort of on the eastern flank of the EU. That is one way that they have been trying to deal with the EU too, and Ukraine is a good example of that. So again, it's we think it tend to be much more complex than we might get from Twitter headlines and newspaper headlines.
And Ayse, let me ask you about the Black Sea area, Turkey, Middle East. I mean, huge Russian influence, financially and otherwise, in that part of the world. Will those countries jump at all, react? Will they change allegiance? Will all of this and the ensuing Western anger about it affect things in the long run, do you think, Ayse?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak about, well, let's start with Turkey. I mean, Turkey has been, Erdogan has been playing both sides of of this equation, and he's been very successful at it. So on the one hand, attracting Russian investments, speaking to the Russians. In fact, I think yesterday Russia said, we respect Turkey as the strongest NATO country, and then at the same time, selling drones to Ukraine, and having Western heads of dignitaries and diplomats come to Turkey to facilitate negotiations, etc. So I think if we were to generalize from that to the rest of the region, I mean, the Caucasus is a bit different, Georgia, etc. I mean, they have their own relationships, dynamics with Russia, but in general, I think Turkey is maybe representative of countries to the south, where they're not really on either side, and they're looking at this as a kind of an opportunity to get what they want from the West, but also not necessarily sever ties with Russia either, because there is a lot of potentially lucrative investments that can come from Russia.
Okay. Just a quick one. Somebody asking, how can countries' interests be reconciled other than by force? Wishful thinking, perhaps, I don't know. A quick one, Hans?
Illusions are always useful. They can be made very useful, as you point out. But it's boring, but diplomacy is important. Not diplomacy just between ambassadors, but also between the second stage, third stage diplomacy, people-to-people contact, university. There are lots of ways to keep channels open, and we have to do that. And on the whole, it's a fun kind of activity. But it is so important not to sort of let that polarization overwhelm everything. There's so many opportunities in each country, each society. And we would be foolish not to use them. I happily talk with Chinese colleagues and Turkish ones, absolutely.
Jaw, not war.
Yeah.
Ayse, we're just about to run out of time. We've got about a minute left. So tell people why they should read your book.
Well, if people want to find out how different parts of Asia, very broadly defined, are connected to each other, and how much they share, and look beyond national religious divisions to a shared connected history, then I'd like to think my book is is a very good place to start.
And it's published by Cambridge University Press, of course, right now. There we are. Hans, tell us about your last book and your next one.
My last book was China at War, which was about the Chinese Second World War, but arguing that China was like France, as much as at war with itself as with Japan. There's used some very interesting memoirs, actually, very, very moving ones. The next book is a history of the Second World War, broadly conceived from an Indonesian, Chinese, and Indian perspective, and arguing that the Second World War was as much about the defeat of European empires and therefore recreated the world as it was about defeating the Japanese.
Brilliant. That's been a fantastic hour. Thank you both. Hans van der Ven and Ayse Zarakol, thank you both for being with me. I'm Chris Mann. I'll be live on BBC Radio Cambridge in a few minutes' time. Thanks all for taking part. I think it was very worthwhile that we did this live. And don't forget to go on the Cambridge Festival website for lots more events. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you, Chris.